Part 2. Welcome back, or welcome all new. My name is Michael Kennedy, and I'm partnering with Juho Korhonen, my workshop co-organizer and a PhD candidate in the Sociology department here at Brown, and with Maud Mandel, Dean of the College and Professor of History and Judaic Studies here at Brown University, in this discussion with Jeff Ely and Ron Suny, at least kicking it off. Maud's most recent monograph, Muslims and Jews in France, History of a Conflict, appeared with Princeton University Press in January 2014. Juho's dissertation, as you just heard if you were here earlier, is still underway, but it concerns the imperial revolutions in Germany and Russia and the rise of self-determination in their wake. One little tidbit I have in common with each of them. I have learned about nations and nationalism with both of them. And I've learned about nations and nationalism with both Ron Suny and Jeff Ely too, and not only by reading their wonderful jointly edited collection, Becoming National, available for purchase outside. That edited introduction may be the only thing they have written together, and it may therefore be the most prominent thing they have done together until at least this discussion. But they are exceptionally distinguished, each in their own right. Jeff Ely is Carl Port Distinguished University Professor of Contemporary History at the University of Michigan, where he has taught since 1979. He has written much with terrific consequence, from reshaping the German right in 1980 through forging democracy in 2002 and a crooked line in 2005, through his current work on a general history of Europe in the 20th century and a new study of the German right. Jeff has been on the cutting edge not only of history and European studies, but in the articulation of cultural studies, social theory, and critical historical sociology, the name that George Steinmetz is now using for the new comparative historical history blog of the American Sociological Association. There's a Michigan effect. Jeff's work in collaboration with many scholars in edited collections among other initiatives has helped to recenter class and gender, articulate colonialism and racism, and revision socialism and democracy in Europe and beyond. He is the finest of historians, an exemplar of interdisciplinarity, and moves one to appreciate that one may be accomplished in the world and still be profoundly decent in everyday life. Ronald Grigor Suny is William H. Sewell, Jr., Distinguished University Professor of History at the University of Michigan. As Jeff, Ron has written much with terrific consequence. From the Baku Commune in 1972 and the making of the Georgian nation in 1988. And more recently, They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, a history of their Armenian genocide. And just out, Red Flag Unfurled, History, Historians, and the Russian Revolution. And the reason I hold this up is that all my other Eley and Suny books are at home. I just bought this one. It's brand new, so you have the opportunity to do that as well. So Ron has been on the cutting edge, too, not only of core competencies in history and Russian and Soviet studies, but one thing we might also say is that he moves those edges. European studies might go with the cultural studies flow, but area studies in the lands formerly ruled by communists are not always so welcoming of reflexivity. To those from those regions, and perhaps even our own, are not always so appreciative of his courage in defying those who feel like they own nations and thus the right to declare what is nationally correct. Ron's career has also been formally interdisciplinary, evident with his emeritus status from political science at the University of Chicago. I wish I could say that his co-edited collection, Intellectuals and the Articulation of the Nation, co-edited with me, is my favorite. But I can't. Because his collaborative spirit and transformational sociology, as Geoff's, goes well beyond any one of us. Ron, too, is the finest of historians, an exemplar of interdisciplinarity, and moves one to recognize that one might be accomplished in the world and still be profoundly decent in everyday life. If you recognize something in common, it is because they reinforce it in one another. Together, Eley's and Suny's decency and distinction might radiate so much now that you should put on your shades. See, I knew it. Too many young people in this audience that don't get the new wave. But as you do that, I'm going to sit down and ask Ron, then Geoff, to come up here and open up the session with offering about 10 or 15 minutes of reflection and get us started. Following their introductions, Maud, Juho, and I will each offer a few rounds of questions, but we will move to a more general public discussion by 4:45. If you are in the audience and don't get your questions in, or if you are in the electronic audience and wish to shape how Juho and I are thinking about the work of Eley and Suny for our paper on their contribution to the social sciences, and especially to critical historical sociology, please send your comments to me at Michael_Kennedy, not .com, at brown.edu. So without further ado, let us welcome Ron Suny to talk to us about 1917.
Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. This is a thrill and a delight. It shows how old you are when they start singing your praises. But at least I'm not lying prone. I'm still standing. This is really nice. And before I start, I want to say something about my colleague and comrade and collaborator, Jeff Ely. It's been an incredible experience working with him all these years. We talk to each other constantly. He is the most generous historian and colleague I can remember, always saying, well, have you read this? I mean, you should look at this, and mentioning this and that, and always somewhat making me feel like I got a lot more work to do. It used to be that he could rattle off these titles without thinking about them and the authors. Now when we go to Zingerman's Roadhouse for our traditional lunches, he says, I can't remember them. And I'm smiling because this has already happened to me some years ago. That's one thing. And years ago, a wonderful anthropologist who was at Michigan, Adam Yengoyan, just recently died, sadly. Adam said to me, you know, Ron, you're really in Jeff's shadow. You have to liberate yourself. You have to become more autonomous. You're just too closely connected to him. And I said, you know, I am happy to play Engels to Jeff's Marx. So, and that's the highest compliment I can give to him. I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, 1917, which once was my phone number, but I couldn't get it lately. Anyway, and this clearly was the second great catastrophe or cataclysm of the short 20th century, the first being the outbreak of the Great War. And what I want to do is draw, in the few minutes I have, some lessons from October. Remember that in those February and March days of that year, the first people on the streets of Petrograd during the war were women. They came out on International Women's Day, March 8th by our calendar, February 23rd by the Julian calendar, and they shamed the men in the factories to come out and join them. This inchoate rebellion then became a revolution when the soldiers, including the Imperial Guards regiments, refused to fire on the crowds. That's the moment when rebellion becomes revolution. The Tsar abdicated, Duma politicians set up the provisional government, and the workers and soldiers elected their own representatives in the Soviets. The first lesson, I think, of that revolution, this being February, not October, was that ordinary people with only the most perfunctory leadership could make history, topple a 300-year-old monarchy, and initiate radical social change with unpredictable consequences. What I want to do, and in fact much of my career and my writing is about this, is rescue that initial revolution and that year from what followed later, the descent into a kind of nightmarish dictatorship, civil war, and eventually Stalinism. Because I note that in much of the writing, if you look, for instance, at the New York Times' special book review essays on the revolution, that what people have been doing in this celebratory year is burying the revolution. That is, linking it to totalitarianism and the fate that ultimately came out. But in that 7 months, between February and October, Russia experienced what you can call a festival of democratic experimentation. Every constituency in the city, and throughout the country indeed, formed committees, held meetings, elected delegates to congresses, passed resolutions, and expressed directly their fears of counter-revolution and hopes for a more just, egalitarian, and participatory political system. But it must be mentioned that civil war was in the air even before February. That is, the fact that there were two governments that emerged from February, the Soviets at the bottom, elected by soldiers and workers and in the countryside by peasants, and the provisional government and bourgeois dumas, etc., already shows that there was a deep polarization socially in the country, reflected in that political division, and great hostility and distrust between these two elements. It would be Lenin, when he returned in April, who would express the view that we must have a single government of the lower classes. That is, a government democratically elected, certainly by the bottom, but that would in fact de facto disenfranchise the middle and upper classes as well as the clergy. That is, in Russian there are two meanings of the word demokratia, democracy. One is what we would understand, representative government, something like that, elections, right? The other is more sociological, no offense meant to sociologists, but that is that demokratia means the demos. It means the people, the ordinary people. And when people use the word in Russian, it can mean the government of the lower classes, but not including those at the top. And that was indeed was Lenin's real vision. So there's a second lesson from the revolution. We haven't even reached October yet. That if you have a situation where there's no shared consensus on the vision of the future, and you have this deeply polarized society, the possibility of civil war it already exists. And Lenin and the Bolshevik understood immediately the impossibility of a coalition of the vital forces of the nations that was advocated by their former comrades, the Mensheviks, and the socialist revolutionaries. And they were calling for all power to the Soviets, which meant a government enabling the lower classes and excluding the middle and upper classes, what was known in Russian at the time as Tsenzovoye Общество. Then when the Bolsheviks did take power in the names of the Soviets, something that was extremely popular by that time, but hopefully would be a government of many different socialist parties, eventually that led to the Bolsheviks' decision to overthrow the most democratically elected Constituent Assembly, the Constitutional Convention, in January 1918, and that, in fact, moved very quickly the revolution toward dictatorship. So Lenin came to power, and things begin to change rather radically at that moment. The utopian expectations that the elimination of somehow imperial oppression and the empowerment of the lower classes would lead spontaneously to something like the vision that he proposed in State and Revolution was confronted by the imperatives and the exigencies of civil war, foreign invasion, division and fragmentation of the country, as many national elites began to separate themselves from the new Soviet project. Lenin had a rather utopian view of how the national problem could be solved. If, in fact, we declare a principle of national self-determination and allow all the non-Russian peoples to go off on their own, full separation, this was his argument, including Finns and Poles and Armenians and Georgians, then they will see that we Russians are not great chauvinists. We, in fact, are not imperialists, and they will gravitate back to a kind of association with the Russians. That was actually his vision. I think it was a sincere vision, but of course it didn't quite work out that way. What happened has been seen traditionally by many historians, let's say like Richard Pipes of Harvard University, is that the Bolsheviks then carried out a series of conquests against the nationalities. And in his book, The Formation of the Soviet Union, it's a series of chapters on these conquests. And what I'm trying to do in my own work is argue that this is a much more complicated situation. Well, that's a kind of cop-out, because everything is a more complicated. Any statement you make, you can then say, well, it's more complicated than that. And it always is more complicated than that. And historians are good at complicating things. We're not so interested in parsimony like some of our colleagues in sociology or political science. But let me just summarize and be a little bit parsimonious here. These years of civil war that started already with the revolution were a series of complex intertwinings of national expressions, usually by urban intellectuals and middle and upper class elites, let's say in Kiev or in Tbilisi or wherever, and also socialist movements, or much more sometimes agrarian movements, anarchist movements, going on at the same time, fighting each other, and complicated by the intervention of Germans and British and French and Turks and Japanese, who aided these, what we'll call from the Soviet side, bourgeois nationalists, right? So these struggles were not simply internal. They were a struggle for power because those foreign interventionists wanted to get rid of the Bolsheviks as well. So the fact that the national struggles, which were which were much weaker than is usually given credit, meant that this struggle was really a struggle for the holding of, for the future of this country. What kind of future you would have? Some kind of unified socialist, eventually federation, or a series of independent states, which would be backed by one or another of the imperialist powers. And following what Juho said before, nationalism was far weaker and far more isolated in the revolution than eventually it would be given credit for. Because there's a kind of assumption that nationalism is natural. Nationalism is an organic, authentic, genuine expression of a people, whereas a class orientation or socialism or alliance with the Russians is artificial and imposed. And it's not quite that way when you look deeply at the Civil War. But of course, Lenin ultimately, in this particular constellation of forces, let's say, I'll give you one example in Ukraine. Let's say in that kind of constellation of forces, in Kharkiv, the Bolsheviks and the Soviets were strong, and they had their supporters. In Kiev, the Rada and the nationalist forces were strong. And a struggle began between them. Without going into great detail, sometimes Lenin would try to make an agreement with the Rada, but eventually he considered them allies of Western powers. He backed the Soviets, and they used whatever force they could to turn the revolution toward the Soviets and declare Soviet power. And this happened through most of the former Russian Empire, except in the Baltic countries, in Finland, Poland, which were allowed to be independent, for a time in Georgia, where the Menshevik government was tolerated until Stalin and Orjonikidze, against Lenin's own inclinations, invaded the country, overthrew the Mensheviks, and established Soviet power, and then Lenin recognized that particular fait accompli. So this is a much more complicated situation than one might think from the beginning. One has to understand that Lenin's Marxism was always genuinely pragmatic. He would adjust to the situation. He would adjust in terms of those things he thought would be best, not only for Bolshevik power in Russia, he wasn't particularly power hungry, but for the international revolution. Lenin was a guy who was ready to sacrifice Russia for the international revolution. And Putin himself has criticized Lenin for exactly this view. So I say he was really, in many ways, a pragmatist. He was a person who understood that a revolution is not an election campaign, It is a war. He was busy reading Clausewitz at the time, as with Hegel. You can imagine our leaders doing that to understand the dialectic at the same time. And one of his favorite, and in a war, it's not a matter of compromise and discussion and negotiation. It's a matter of having men with guns at the right place at the right time in order to win. That's how he saw the revolution. He, as I mentioned, he was pragmatic. One of his favorite and repeated remarks was, and I quote, "Facts are stubborn things. You can't beat facts by gossip." There were no alternative facts at that particular time. So, what lessons then can we learn from this particular sketch that I've tried to give you? And these are what I would call some of the major lessons of October. Forgive me for turning all these pages, but I always have to have a kind of crutch to know what I'm about to say. I guess what I've already indicated to you is that one of the harshest lessons of the revolution was that war and civil war polarized politics and thereby undermine democratic choices. And they also give well-placed elites enormous discretion to shape the nature of a political regime. In a situation of near anarchy, without strong institutions to constrain the actions of those in positions of influence and power, however humane and progressive their ambitions and goals might be, the will of the people will be compromised, even jettisoned. I would say that this lesson was even more starkly shown with the final crisis of the Soviet Union, when ostensible Democrats led by Yeltsin, in fact, carried out their own coup against Gorbachev and eventually their own parliament, weakening the polity. Self-proclaimed reformers around Boris Yeltsin in 1993 imposed a rather centralized constitution, a presidential constitution, which was fine as long as you had a president who had a heart condition and was alcoholic, namely Yeltsin, but eventuated in the authoritarianism of a rather strong, bare-chested guy, former KGB agent Vladimir Putin. And those decisions were made at the top. They were made by elites against the expressions of ordinary people. Very often people, and it's something that I've tried to work out in my own work and in my lectures to my students, people blame the Russian people themselves for the failures of democracy. That is, as if there's some kind of essential quality of Russians, that they love the knout. They love strong men, because we don't love strong men in America. They need an authoritarian figure, as if their own national characteristics led to this. And yet we have instances, one of which I just illuminated in 1917, in which people expressed their own desires for some much more participatory regime in which ordinary people would have power. The same thing was expressed under Gorbachev and in the early Yeltsin years. And yet these things didn't work out in the largest country in the world. Human beings, said a great German philosopher, Karl Marx, make their own history, but not under circumstances chosen by themselves. It seems to me that one of the things we know as historians is that history constrains as well as enables. And maybe that's another lesson that we learned from the Russian Revolution. Opportunities were missed. Risks were not taken. Oh, maybe they were fleeting opportunities, but they were not taken. And wrong choices were made that sent the revolution down a tragic track. As someone who is very loyal to the ideas and values and approaches of Marxism, I must say in my own evolution, I've moved further and further from structuralist to agent-centered explanations. Structures are important. You can't walk through walls. Let's use the door. But still, ultimately, you make the choice whether you want to hit your head against the wall or go through the door. And it seems to me that it's not accidental that I'm writing a biography of the young Stalin. Actually, it's finished and Princeton's going to publish it. So after 30 years, you can go buy another book. But in fact, it seems to me those choices that these elite figures make, as we can see going on at this particular time in our own country, are extraordinarily important for the kinds of future that we may likely have. Let me give you an example. In March of 1921, Lenin, who had been so strategically savvy in October of 1917, found himself in another moment of crisis. The Civil War had come to an end. There was a revolt of sailors in Kronstadt. 50,000 or 60,000 peasants were in revolt in Tambov province. And within the party, there was an opposition, the workers' opposition, calling for more democracy within the party. And what did Lenin do? They crushed the Kronstadt revolt, okay, revolt against the government. They crushed the Tambov revolt. They opened up the economic policy with a so-called new economic policy, NEP, giving the peasants more control over their agriculture. And at that very moment, Lenin also decreed there will be no factions within the Communist Party, right? There will be no, once a decision is made, it is under democratic centralism, it will be decided. The fact that factions were crushed or stopped in March 1921 meant that that kind of freewheeling discussion that had actually characterized the Bolshevik Party all through the Civil War, when they were in real danger, would no longer go on. And that led ultimately to one group becoming the dominant faction, and eventually one man in that group, Joseph Stalin, becoming the dictator. So I want to conclude with this statement. You'll forgive me for the time I'm taking up, but a Russian historian at a prestigious West Coast university once told me with great conviction, nothing good has come out of the Soviet Union. There was nothing redeemable or praiseworthy. And I was taken aback by this categorical condemnation. And I asked him, well, what about the victory over fascism? The Soviets, after all, took on 3/4 of the Nazi forces, as well as the Allied Finns, Romanians, Hungarians, and others. It was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz and other death camps in the East and essentially brought the Holocaust to an end. Ironically, it was the Red Army that saved the world for democracy and capitalism. Or what about the industrialization of a vast peasant land, forced to be sure, inefficient and chaotic in many ways, but adequate enough eventually to raise the standard of living of tens of millions of people, to turn the country from 80% rural to 80% urban, and indeed to create an educated population that after half a century of paternalistic rule by the Communist Party no longer needed the Communist Party. This I call the dilemma of empire. What if your civilizing mission actually works and you civilize people, urbanize and educate them? Who needs the imperial power anymore? So in other words, I don't see the Soviet Union, this experiment, as all a failure, but as successes that eventually led to its own demise. Well, of course, there's an invisible elephant in the room, isn't there, with orange hair. You can't anymore do scholarship or talk to your students without understanding that we're living in a Trumptopia. That is a world in which facts are not stubborn things, but are to be manipulated. And so there's a kind of pessimism about the world. And yet it seems to me we can learn one essential lesson from this Soviet experience, and that is there cannot be anything that we would legitimately call socialism without democracy, without full, real participation of ordinary people in decision-making. And if there's anything we can learn from American history in the last half century, it seems to me there's no real democracy without something like socialism. That is, as wealth is polarized, as corporations take over more and more of the instruments and means of public opinion, as money becomes speech and corporations become people, as bourgeois democracy reaches its limits, it seems to me we have to move to something on. Well, it's always easier for a scholar to stand here and state the nature of a problem rather than to find a solution. So perhaps what this symposium is doing and what we're thinking about today is, what if we think more clearly about the history of the 20th century? What if we tried to give more complex and nuanced answers and evaluations of these different experiences? Can understanding the past give us a different kind of understanding of the present and the possibilities of the future? I always tell my students, don't mistake the future. Don't mistake the present for the future. You're going to live a long time. Things are going to change. Dark times may lay ahead right now, but progressive discourses like history, like sociology at its best, are powerful enablers and constraints. A new, more positive, perhaps utopian discourse about democracy and socialism may provide a light at the end of a dark tunnel. Right now, the task is to find that tunnel. Thank you.
And now Jeff Ely comes to the podium.
There's no clock in here.
There's a clock behind you.
Oh, well, I'll use this in that case. Well, thanks, Michael. I'm speechless, for the moment at least. Great to be here. I actually no idea what to say. Since the field is of topics and questions is so wide, so I'll just ramble for a while, okay? And I spend a lot of time these days, and it's not just since the election, but it really began around about 2005. Writing and thinking and talking about fascism. Now, it is true that, when I first seriously became a historian, my ground of research, my training was as a historian of, we had all sorts of reluctance to use the concept of pre-fascism because it implied teleology, which was, like the cardinal sin, of the 1970s. But I was working not on Nazism, but on the conditions of possibility for Nazism. So how, my question was really, how do we locate German fascism in an argument, and then of course we started saying a narrative of German history that wasn't, teleological in that Sonderweg sense. So how do we, how do we do that? How do we produce a better, deep, contextual explanation for the German difference? And so I worked on, my first book was Reshaping the German Right. It was on political change and radical nationalism before between the 1890s and the 1920s, really before the First World War. And it was about how were some of the conditions of possibility for fascism produced historically, and why in Germany rather than in Britain or France. So and in the early 1980s, I published an essay on fascism as such that was my attempt to sort of take stock of the huge amount of principally social science influenced literature on comparative fascism that was generated between the mid-1960s and the end of the 1970s. And that's when I published an essay called, oh God, I can't even remember my own titles anymore. Pre-industrial traditions or a crisis of the capitalist state. Okay, so that was the antinomy, it seemed to me, that we were thinking within in the 1970s, and most people came out with pre-industrial traditions or some version thereof, or some historical sociology of fascism that specifically did not want to talk about capitalism. Okay. So I sort of wrote that essay in the early 1980s. It was my attempt to mark out a more sophisticated, more careful, structuralist approach to this question of, you know, how to explain, how to understand fascism. And that's basically where I left it, you know, and that's how that was my framework for the next 25 years. And of course, by the early 2000s, a lot had happened in terms of the intellectual histories of the present, whether we think of those in relation to the academic disciplines or in relation to cultural life more generally. And of course, a lot had happened politically. And so I've been thinking for a while that I should revisit this question. And then a friend of mine in Chicago said to me, you know, what we really need, around 2005, what we really need from you German historians is some help with this question, right? Of how to understand fascism today, you know, how to abstract from the complex histories that have been generated during the last 30 years about the early 20th century, how to abstract a concept of fascism that's portable and usable for other times and places, whether the present or elsewhere in the earlier 20th century. And so really during the following 10 years, I sort of gradually got closer and closer to doing that. And then a few years ago, I published this book, Nazism as Fascism. And of course, the urgencies of grappling with that question have become more and more apparent. Not least, you know, since the last presidential election and the resurgence of the far right in pretty much most of Europe in one version or another, and in other parts of the world too. And when I give you know, one of my talks on fascism, you know, one of them is called Fascism Then and Now. Another is called Is Trump a Fascist? You know, I tend to start. I start with oh God, Collingwood. You see, I'm just, you know, now performing what Ron described. So I begin with Collingwood and Croce. So I said all history is contemporary history. You know, in terms of the urgencies of the questions that are posed to us and that motivate our engagement with the past. You know, and the past only becomes history when historians get to work on it. You know, that's one of the sort of the very important distinctions that runs through this interesting paper that Mike and Juho, I wasn't remember if it was Yoho or Juho, Juho have written. You know, so this, you know, the past is everything that's happened that by definition is not recoverable, and it only becomes history when it's worked into arguments by historians. So I begin with, you know, Collingwood and Croce, and they, you know, they have these metaphors of the past vibrating in the mind of the historian. It's the and then I make a joke about the vibrationist theory of history. And then I go to Benjamin. And, you know, the true image of the past, this is not an exact quotation, but the true image of the past is the one that flits up at a moment of danger. It's a wonderful evocation of, you know, of the ways in which the urgencies of the present call us to a certain kind of historical thinking and historical writing, you know, and I think we're in one of those very dramatic moments today. I mean, today meaning, you know, the contemporary moment. I mean, we are living through a state of emergency, it seems to me, where the challenges for historians, and here I'm using historians as Gramsci used intellectuals, everybody's an intellectual at one level, everybody is a historian too, in terms of how we construct our thinking about present political priorities. We're constitutionally incapable, I mean, humans that is, we are constitutionally incapable of thinking about contemporary problems without drawing upon the past in one way or another, whether it's consciously, deliberately, semi-consciously, or unconsciously. And so, so that's the first thing that I want to say, really. The urgencies of the contemporary situation that we're living through, and the kinds of history the kinds of historical thinking that calls on us to do, that it requires us to do, if we're responsible political actors and responsible citizens. Following on from that, I want to say something now about the different ways in which those urgencies have been experienced by me over the duration of the career that these guys have been picking over in that paper. Because I think in the late 1960s and the 1970s, the main felt urgency, how long should I speak for? 10 more minutes. The main felt urgency was about recuperation, about retrieval, about, we had these, the resonant phrases of the time for radical historians were, hidden histories, hidden from history, like reconstructing the available narratives for understanding the national past or other pasts. And, we thought principally within, nationally bounded pasts, I think. And then that became reformulated over, the intervening years as excavation, archaeologies of knowledge, recuperation. I mean, they're all attempts, I think, to reformulate in more careful and more cautious ways that impulse, towards retrieval and telling histories that have not been told. There was a lot of disparagement of that idea in the 1980s during the, as the cultural, what we now call the cultural turn got underway, as though somehow just doing that was kind of less important, less sophisticated than the various kind of post-Foucauldian and other strategies that we were being called upon to use in order to understand the work that we were doing as historians in relation to the past. I think retrieval is incredibly important. I think telling those histories that have been suppressed and not told before is an incredibly important priority. So writing history against the grain, okay? And I think if I was writing, if I was to write my intellectual autobiography, which I sort of did some of in that Crooked Line book, then it would be about trying to, how to escape from what, or how to avoid what Gareth Stedman Jones in an unfortunate essay in the 1990s called the Determinist Fix. So how do you get out of the determinist trap? How do you escape from the constraining and simplifying consequences of the base superstructure metaphor, which I think was one of the primary sort of conceptual instruments of the Marxism that I was originally formed in, which I think was which Ron was formed within too, in the 1960s and the early 1970s. So how do you understand politics, ideology, culture, both in very macro terms, so political development, state formation, revolutions, and so on, and in very specific local, personal, community, neighborhood, workplace-based, movement-based, many other micro-contextual forms of analysis. So how do you understand politics, ideology, and culture, at all of those different levels, in relation to material conditions, structures, and processes? That's and the base superstructure metaphor, as it was deployed by Marx, was a wonderful means of doing that. It was very empowering and enabling for a long time. But how do you escape from the simplifying consequences of that? And my relationship to Marxism was a very long process of reading, learning, discussing, and wrestling with that abiding problem. And I think actually it's still our problem, okay? Although the sort of the priorities have become reversed. Now I think the contemporary iteration of the problem is how do we, now we've all taken the cultural turn, how do we get back to materialities? Not least because we've had this, global financial crisis of 2008, and B, the world is ending because of what we now know about the Anthropocene. Well, we need, to kind of reformulate a new materialism in order to grapple with those really serious structural problems. So, in my own case, the attraction of the British Marxist historians was that in empirical, analytical ways, in the richness and the textured sophistication of the histories that they produced, they actually, the base superstructure metaphor was not a constraining and limiting and simplifying thing. I mean, if you look at Hobsbawm's writings, and if Hobsbawm was asked, about these questions, he would subscribe to a version of the base superstructure kind of schema. But if you look at his actual histories, they're unbelievably more sophisticated than that. And then so the British Marxist historians were always an incredibly important resource in those ways. And then, of course, Gramsci and the selections from the prison notebooks were published in 1971, in English, that is, which was when in my first year in graduate school. And then there was feminist theory, the Althusser reception, then, of course, came the Foucault reception. And running through it all was Raymond Williams and then Stuart Hall. And somebody earlier this afternoon quoted, "Is all the world a text?" which was my attempt around about 1990 to reflect on everything that I'm now alluding to. And I think at a certain point, and I'm sort of coming to a close now, and bridging to the questions that you guys had formulated for Ron and me. At a certain point in the course of the 1980s, it just got too hard, to kind of think the relationship of politics, ideology, consciousness, culture, discourse, to think the relationship of culture in relation to structures and the economy. It just got too complicated to go any further, right? And it's interesting because, part of my, as well as, reshaping the German right, I mean, my other early book was this book with David Blackburn, Peculiarities of German History, which I guess is what I might be most known for. This critique of the Sonderweg and German exceptionalism and so on. And there is an argument in that book about bourgeois revolution as the macro-historical mechanism for transition to, societies dominated by the capitalist mode, right? Well, that, you can't have and there is this famous, many times quoted, including by me, statement in the 1859 preface where Marx lays it out, at a certain point, as he's been discussing, the rise of capitalism, and he says, and then begins a period of revolution. That's the argument about bourgeois revolution. And that was really important to me when I was a young person, to try and understand, macro-historical processes of change in relation to these concepts of the necessity of political convulsions, revolutions, in order to secure the conditions for the further development of society, right? Well, at a certain point, I just stopped thinking in those ways because it got too complicated. And in 1987, I published an essay called In Search of the Bourgeois Revolution, which is possibly one of the few, ones that you don't find in that paper. And it was published in a sociology yearbook. It was Maurice Zeitlin's yearbook then, Political Power and Social Theory. And that's my theory that's my attempt to explain how we can operationalize this concept of bourgeois revolution. And after that, I stopped using it, using the concept. And I can say more about what I think about the relationship between history and sociology, and historical sociology in the Q&A time that's coming, because that was a kind of a really important symptomatic moment for me. And of course, that's against the backcloth of everything that we now call the cultural turn, right? Well, at the AHA in January, Andrew Zimmerman and I are doing a panel on bourgeois revolution, on the concept of bourgeois revolution, because it does seem to me that we still do need ways of understanding how the generative possibilities for future forms of macro-political development are produced through crisis. And those earlier revolutionary contexts, whether it's 1917 or the 19th century, or indeed the other early 20th century revolutionary histories, are very important for in delivering the materials with which we can think in order to try and understand how those questions might be addressed in our contemporary circumstances, right? So I hope that was reasonably coherent, and I think I'll stop there.
So as I mentioned before, I will ask a question, then we'll get some responses, then Ronald will ask a question, and so
I was wondering, actually, I know I proposed that, but maybe we should do 3 questions and then let them just, in the interest of time.
let's do that. And Yeah, do you want to go first? Or, I mean, I'm ready.
You can go for whatever. If we're going to go in a row, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, all right, so you can see why it's such a treat and pleasure to be able to work with Geoff and Ron. Because the question that you had thought about for a long time is now already redundant. And so it makes you always think much further about what it is you want to ask next. And I actually think thanks to the panel this morning, and thanks to the way in which we concluded this morning, I would like to pose something in this way. The way Holly was giving us those three options. If you weren't here earlier, you should watch the recording to learn what those three options are. And then someone came up after that session and said, you know, actually, those three options are not talking in a sociology way. And obviously not, right? Because sociology is always in the midst of wondering how its explanations of things happening now wind up shaping those outcomes. The idea that we can somehow have a sociology that is innocent of political effect is, to me, an ideology that is operative in sociology, but it is one that proposes an innocence that is not viable. And so if it's not viable, then we have to think about the ways in which our knowledge is implicated. And so I have come to embrace this term knowledge activism. The idea that the questions that we pose are almost inevitably implicated in the kinds of not just activist struggles, but other political struggles that are happening around us. Point one. Point two, very briefly. Michael Buravoy wrote a really lovely essay on revolution, in which he contrasted Theda Skocpol and Trotsky, and said that Skocpol theorized revolution from without. Trotsky theorized it from within. Both of them are pretty serious intellectuals, but the expectations of each are radically different. And so that's where I want to take the question to Geoff and Ron, and that is to ask them not to tell us, which I had originally intended, what is the concept, what is the problem that we should be thinking about most right now, but rather, how do you feel with all that you know now, as opposed to the period immediately following, not the revolution of 1917, but the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because in that time of collapse of the Soviet Union, at least for me as someone who wanted to think about the questions that Ron was posing about the relationship between democracy and socialism, all of a sudden I felt like the albatross was taken from around my neck. But today, I feel no albatross. I just feel a big foot pressing down on my gut, wondering how it is that all of this learning is relevant to the future I would like to see. And so I would just like, just tell me the feel, because you've lived through these different periods in engaged scholarly fashion. So, Mom.
Do you want to go next? Do you want me to?
Yeah, all right.
Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to. So I'm just going to be self-indulgent for a second. It might seem an odd choice for this panel in some ways. I am a historian, but I work on different fields than the folks around the table here. But three of these people have had a huge influence on my life. So I took a class in graduate school with Michael Kennedy. Two men to my right were on my doctoral dissertation committee and prelims committee. So those of you who are graduate students in the room, if you can project yourself forward 20 years to the experience of sitting at a table where you get to publicly thank people who have shaped who you are intellectually and launched you on your trajectory. I won't tell you specific stories about how that happened, but I can say that they all three had a huge impact on my life. So thank you for that. So I think I sort of have it's not quite the same question, but I think as I was thinking about today and thinking about having a chance to talk to you right now in this historical moment and framed around the idea of a 100-year anniversary of thinking about the century and historical change and what history means and in an interdisciplinary context, I have two really, I guess, unrelated questions. The first is very much related to the moment we all met. So I did my graduate work in the 90s, really, and the moment the cultural turn was really taking off, and the University of Michigan was a place where a lot of that work was going strong. So interdisciplinarity, something we think of as sort of profoundly interdisciplinarity, was happening there. It was a bit of shock, actually, to come to Brown, where the cultural turn actually had not had nearly as much of an impact. I've spent the last 20 years here, and actually Ron said to me at one point, it's your first job that shapes you more intellectually than where you go to graduate school, which is something I'd like to talk about later. But it was a change to come here, and I'm struck by the conversation today at the beginning and here too as we've gone on about sort of where we are interdisciplinarily. Is that a word? So you all in a paper that nobody here has read, but has spoke a lot about the sort of intersections of history and sociology. The papers this morning came from history, or earlier this afternoon came from history and sociology. In some ways, I feel like we're sort of having a conversation again that I thought we sort of had moved beyond. And I guess so my question in some ways to both of you is, is there a, did the cultural turn move us forward in an interdisciplinary way, in your opinion? And if so, how is it different now? How do we think in a different way? And Geoff, I was really struck by something, because in grad school, one of the things I remember people saying, graduate students saying, was, we have so much we have to read because we have to know everything they know. And then we now also have to read everything in all the other fields. So we need all that social history. And now we have to read the anthropology and the sociology, and in order to keep up with them, because they're so smart and they know so much. So we have to do all of this work, all of this reading. And I was really struck when you said up there about it's also complicated. Actually, that quite resonated back then, but it still in some ways resonates with me now, to the extent to which, in some ways, interdisciplinarity sort of in some ways overcomplicated history, and in some ways I think people have sort of run away from it. So I'm just a little bit curious to pose the question of interdisciplinarity to both of you. And then the second question is a more personal question. It kind of leaps from Michael's, which is, and I hope you don't take it the wrong way, but I wonder if you're tired. And what I mean by that specifically is, given all you've studied and seen, and given the conversation we're having today about where we are in the country, where we are with the study of history, how we think about change over time, is the creative energy and thinking of coming up with new ideas and moving forward and inspiring and engaging one, or is it sort of a deflating one in light of sort of what hasn't been solved? And it goes back to, I think, the question of are we still hunting for a pure methodology that is going to lead to social and revolutionary change that makes the world a better place, or do you have a more sort of, I guess, pessimistic perspective on that now? So.
All right, so thanks, Geoff and Ron, for being here. After reading so many of your works, it's amazing, and I have many questions, but I guess I'll ask the one that relates most closely to our paper, and actually also relates to Maud's and Michael's questions as well. And I'll preface this to the audience a little bit. Historical sociologist Michael Mann says, quoting Flaubert, that writing history is like drinking an ocean and pissing a cupful. But then he goes on to say that in his own work, the techniques of historical sociology enable him to take a shortcut through identifying the main social structural trends of societies, and this enables me to drink less but a thicker liquid. So this is the general question about the relationship between sociology and history that we try to tackle in our paper through your works. And I would like to ask basically your take on it. You have both offered your own critiques of sociology as a disciplinary practice, but also engaged it in your own scholarship and worked with many sociologists. So if you could help us out a bit in terms of, understanding the dialogue between sociology and history, even though we're having it all over again, perhaps. But since I'm a graduate student, I'm having it for the first time now. What kind of sociological dispositions or examples do you find compelling in general, and why? Thank you.
You go first, Jeff. Huh?
Well, when I invoked that 1987 article of mine, and I could then have added. So I actually don't read much historical sociology anymore. In the 70s and the 80s, when some of the, am I speaking loud enough?
You can pull forward the mic.
In the 1970s and the 1980s, when the big, or some of the big questions for me were about, political development and, forms of political development, state formation, revolutions, all of that, Barrington Moore to Scotchbowl to Wallerstein. I mean, all of those, Perry Anderson, of course. That was my my daily fare, Well, in the course of the 1980s, for me the questions shifted, and through that very turbulent and incredibly complex set of intellectual histories that we now call the cultural turn, right? And I remember, and I like Michael Mann, right, personally, and I like his stuff, especially the essays, as opposed to these bloody great big thick books. But when he was writing Volume 3, he sent a few chapters to me, and this would have been the mid-90s, I guess, and they were about, Europe before 1914, and I sent him incredibly long, detailed comments and disagreed with him about this and said I thought he should, it would be good to take that discussion in this direction, and had he read this, and so on, and he paid absolutely no attention to any of those responses, right? So I treat this, this quotation that you used with a grain of salt. I think it's kind of specious, because I think that the historical side. I'm going to be slightly polemical and and be a bit of a devil's advocate, because I don't completely think this. But I think historical sociologists, present company accepted, aren't much interested in that thickness of contextualizing that you spend a lot of time talking about so interestingly in the paper. And I think you're dead right in your critique of of Tilly derived and others historical sociology, because, and it's not true of people like George Steinmetz, I should also add. So there are really vital exceptions, but on the whole, Rogers Brubaker, I can never remember which way round his two names go. That guy.
That's right.
Who I also like. He published this book. In the paper they cite this book on what does he call it? It's on nationalism. Citizenship and nationalism. In which he compares Germany and France, and it's all based on an incredibly thin appropriation of a few works in French history and a few works in German history, and he builds this huge argument on it, and it's just crap.
He became a MacArthur genius.
Our ratings are going way up.
And so it's thin. It's so unbelievably thin. And everything that he bases, the two cases on, historiographically speaking, has been superseded very quickly. And historians are thinking about those questions of citizenship in those two cases, and comparatively, much more fruitfully, and much more responsibly, I would say. So there's a way in which the conditions of the production of knowledge in the discipline of sociology militate against the kind of thickness of analytical engagement, which is part of the generative process of theory production, that I think we all hold dear, right? So now, again, I don't want to be over polemical. I mean, there are some very good historical sociologists,
Including Rogers Brubaker. That is, first of all, his later books completely contradict that early book, right?
Well,
So
yeah.
Nationalism Reframed has a different theory. He borrowed largely from me, but he doesn't cite me. So the last footnote, but that's all right. That's all right. If you read the essay about making nations in the Soviet Union, then at the end he mentions the footnote. And also the Transylvania book, which is a really good
Yeah.
book, is a very deeply researched and book, and is very contextual. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
And he
I
learned Hungarian.
I like him.
Yeah. I like him too.
I
He's
do,
small, but
so
I
I
like him.
accept that. Okay, so now much more quickly and less polemically. Where are we now with interdisciplinarity? And it's true, when I was in graduate school, you could read everything.
Right.
Literally, you could read everything. In my field or more broadly, there wasn't that much. And in English, there was, virtually nothing in my period of German history. So you can read it many times when you were getting ready for the archive. Going over it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for clues, Well, now,
Right.
Maud's completely right, and if it was true in the 1990s, which it was, it's like magnified hugely now.
Right.
So when we're training students, they have to not only read the literatures in their field, they have to do it comparatively. You have to be interdisciplinary. You've got to do theory. It's impossible.
Yeah.
But you got to do it. You got to find ways of doing it. You have to develop reading techniques. You have to, be more selective in the books that you actually read rather than the ones that you create that you're able to place on a map. I talk to our students about the importance of making a map of whether it's the field or the broader, arrays of literature that from other disciplines that are necessary. I mean, you've got to develop a map. You've got to be a really terrific critical bibliographer. That's one of the most important skills. And so you make the map, and then when you encounter literature, whether it's books or articles or something you hear about in a talk, now we word process, so it's much easier to do that. If you've got a system that you begin with, instead of one that you construct after you come back from the archives, which is what we had to do, right? But I think, Marxism is the interdisciplinary knowledge par excellence, Everything is relevant. And that's what I think, still.
You do.
Yeah. Everything is relevant. You've just got to be much more, clever and adept at making that map. Right?
Sorry, I'm going to jump in because it makes me think a little bit of where we are with popular culture. So there was a time where you could watch it, everybody was watching the same thing and talking about the same thing, and you made the same jokes, everybody had seen the same show. And now we all have our own individual sort of map of things, and it does overlap with somebody else's, but it's not identical, and you can still have a conversation about it, but you might have references that don't make sense to anybody but the two other people you watched something with. And it feels a little the same to me in the study of history now, or any other discipline, which is your own map is your own map. It fits very well at Brown, actually. You make your own map, and it's not identical to anybody else's map, and you're in conversation with lots of people about a lot of things, but it's not as though one intervention is going to change a whole field in quite the way that was the case before. This sort of brings me back to the sort of the both the blessing and curse of interdisciplinarity, because you're talking to everybody and nobody at the same time.
Well, I wouldn't be as despairing as that.
It was
Actually,
make a
I think it's a great time to be a historian, or to be whatever discipline you're in, because
that's good. So you're not tired.
Hardly.
It's a great time.
okay. So I should let you say stuff now, but very quickly though, in relation to how do we? I can't remember who asked how did we feel after? Did you ask that?
Yeah.
Well, we sat on his floor. We used to live around, there was a period of about 8 years where we lived around the corner from each other. And I used to go over there in the evening, when everybody else was in bed. And we'd sit on his floor and talk, and, that's when we produced Becoming National, that reader. But we watched the events of 1987, 88, 89, 90, and 91. And it was amazing. How did we feel? This is it moves. History moves. It moves. That's how we felt, and it was extraordinary, and it was and we were incredibly optimistic, I think.
And you see what happened, right? Yeah.
It was
well,
exhilarating.
Yeah. First, I'm going to say something about this, the paper, and I often tell people that our friendship and collaboration is based on two things: Marxism, which is underplayed in your paper, by the way. That is the centrality and the importance of a certain shared intellectual commitment, which is now more about values and preferences than about economics or that. But that's very important.
It is about integrated thinking. It's
Oh,
about
absolutely.
Everything
Right.
is relevant and
Though
usable.
we've questioned that as well. That is, there's a whole critique of totality, but I'm still with you on that. All right. That is, Marx is about sets of questions, like the relationship of politics to society, right, and to the modes of production and all those kinds of things. And when I give courses to freshmen, basically, I'm teaching a freshman seminar now called History of Our Own Times, History of the Present. And it's basically Marxism, right? It's about the nature of capitalism, how it's central to what's going on, and how other things flow from it, and some things don't flow from it, etc. So Marxism was a big part of our relationship, that kind of common commitment, so that certain things didn't have to be over and over questioned, but always interrogated in terms of what we were interested in. And the second was gossip. That is,
I was wondering what was happening.
yeah. The second was, and that was also important, right? To interrogate again, relationships, personalities in the field, what was going on, And so when we do these lunches at the Roadhouse in Ann Arbor, it's always, so what's going on, who's doing what, and that's also important. Kind of sharing both the personal and the political and all that stuff. So, a couple of things. First of all, I think one of the things that's come out of this, and certainly in your paper, which is really important, is that history is historiography. History is the writing and the rewriting. Revisionism is not a bad word. It's been used wrongly, and there are terrible revisionisms about the Armenian genocide, about the Holocaust, but they're good revisionisms about American history being more inclusive, et cetera, et cetera. So it's constant revisionism, right? And it's constantly questioning what we know, et cetera. And as I think Geoff said, and we know, it's about the moment. It's about today. That is, the first book I give the freshmen is E.H. Carr's What is History? Which is, and they really do learn something about the fact that history is not this object like a table, but rather it's a thing that's in process, and it's a thing that is created over and over again by historians, but it's not fiction. It's fiction in one sense that it's made, it's fabricated, but it's not fiction like a novel. Though, by the way, there's a tendency of these students nowadays to call historical works novels. In his novel, right, E.H. Carr writes the following. Why? It's not a novel, but they use that for some reason. I don't know where that comes from. I had to check on Wikipedia. Novel is fiction, not nonfiction. In any case, it's something fabricated, but according to strict conventions and protocols. You know, real evidence that can be tested, and all the other things. I'll mention something about that. Well, a narrative that's persuasive and so forth. So that's one thing. And that is a problem with sociology, that sometimes Geoff, in a very radical way or crude way, said that, you know, that it's a thin acceptance. And I saw that in political science all the time. And I learned a very interesting thing in political science. It's called selection on the dependent variable. That is what they do all the time. They're always, they
You should
first
tell
they
that he was in a department of political science
for
a
11
while.
years.
Okay.
Yeah. A wonderful one, University of Chicago. It's a great university. But they would first have a theory, and the idea was that you had to end up with a theory too, right? So they had a theory, and then they did their work that fit the theory, right? But didn't do the heavy lifting of all the historiographical things to show contradictions, et cetera, right? The anomalies that were. I certainly agree with Michael that there's no history of sociology without politics. That is, politics in all the senses, and that by the very act of writing history, whether you think you're just describing a town in Poland where the Holocaust took place, right, which is what Omar's work is so brilliantly about, the last book, you're doing politics. It's telling you something about some horrific thing that happened, why it happened, how it affected people in this place, and it has all kinds of political ramifications. I would say to the graduate students and to my colleagues here and everyone, what we are doing now, the intellectual work we're doing now, the hard work of historians in interpreting, understanding, analyzing, trying to explain, is more important now than it's ever been in my lifetime, right? We thought it was important during the Cold War to try to nuance and complicate what the Soviet Union was about. We had a kind of détentiste politics so that we wouldn't have nuclear war. We thought that was important. But now, I mean, this is a very, very particular and peculiar moment, right? It's a moment in which the real possibilities of surviving capitalism and its damage to human beings and the environment and nature, right, especially with the people who are in control of much of the world today, is really reaching its finality, right? And the same, and I think, you know, Juho said this as well, the nation state. So there are three big things going on in the world. One is globalization, which is a euphemism for international capitalism, global capitalism. The second is whether the nation state will survive, and in many ways, the first thing, capitalism, as Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, is undermining the nation. He got it a little early, right? He sort of thought it was shorter than it was going to be. But something's happening. There's not the same kind of sovereignty that we used to have before, right? And the third big process in the world, which is also about to collapse, is American hegemony. The idea that this country can be the global hegemon and stop others from competing, China or Russia or Iran or wherever, right? And you see how much it's cost us in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, and who knows if in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula or whatever. Those three things are all coming to a kind of finality. And we have to be able to talk about that as well. But what Marxism and what our kind of analysis, it seems, and good historical work and sociological work and political science too at its best is showing is a kind of pessimistic picture, right? So Marxism is what Perry Anderson at the moment called a Marxism of despair, right? Or in the words of one of my favorite political scientists, Adam Przeworski, capitalism is intolerable, socialism is impossible. That is, we live in a one-dimensional world in which the alternatives are horrific. What, fundamentalist Islam? I mean, are these alternatives? Fundamentalist Buddhism, like in Myanmar? Fundamentalist Christianity, as in this country? Fundamentalist Judaism or Zionism, as in Israel? I mean, these are not ways out of crisis. They're deepening the crisis. So, but here's what I would say is, don't despair. Think about, you know, the future being different. We can't let our students despair. Don't despair. Think about this moment as something like, let's say you lived Forgive me, early modernists. Hope there's no early modernists. But anyway, I love early modernists. You know, my best friend Valerie Kivelson is an early modernist. Besides Geoff, I mean, my best female friend. Think if you lived in 1750. There was no revolution on the horizon. This was a moment of absolutism, feudal aristocracy, the noblesse de robe and the noblesse d'épée and so forth. And yet, within a few years, 7 Years' War, death crisis, calling of the Estates General, revolution, first the American Revolution, and then the French Revolution, things change and the world changed, right? Or, so, I mean, it seems to me we're in that moment, a kind of congealed moment in which the elements of crisis should be more evident than they are. They are evident, but we have to note that the present is not the future. And the question you asked about 1991, well, I was in despair, and I was in despair in 1991 because we were so hopeful about the Gorbachev years. That is, I always thought the Soviet Union could have evolved and was evolving toward a more democratic socialism. Now, it was the fall of the Soviet Union was relatively contingent. There was no general crisis in the Soviet Union. There was no serious international threat. There was no revolt from below. The Soviet Union committed suicide. This is what I teach, so I know about this. Yeah, the Soviet Union committed suicide. Gorbachev and his guys decided to carry out this grand reform and did it very badly and were unwilling to use force in order to get what they needed to get. Right? Gorbachev was no Abraham Lincoln. He allowed the thing to fall apart, not using the kind of violence that was necessary or force that could happen. And you see how different that was from China, where they did use the force, regrettably, but they did, right? The second thing is a lot of what I think Geoff and I have been trying to do is rescue socialism. There's some idea of socialism, right? Geoff's book, Forging Democracy, is that without the working class and without the socialist movements, we wouldn't have even democracy, bourgeois democracy today, which is certainly an advance on what existed before. I just reviewed Stephen Kotkin's second volume. It's a big book. I mean, if you want to build up your biceps, carry that book around and read all 902 pages and then the 200 pages of notes in 8-point font afterwards, if you want to. It's not a bad book. It's not a bad book. But Kotkin does. Also, that book is a book for this time for America, because it's a book that says Stalinism was socialism. That's what socialism was, right? No idea that there was social democracy, or that there were Trotskyists, or that there were alternative Marxist intellectuals. That this was socialism. If you want anti-capitalism, this is what you're going to get, right? Well, that is a politics that is expressed. It's a good politics. It's a politics. For him, it's a good politics. It's a politics which means that the Soviet Union, as socialism, which was the Stalinist view, is also the view of lots of liberals and conservatives, right? And who would ever want that, right? So there's no alternative there, right? So there was a lot of regret about the Soviet Union. I'm not quite where Putin says, this was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. No, there was the Armenian genocide, as well as other genocides and so forth. There were many catastrophes. 2 world wars maybe would be greater catastrophes, etc. So I'm not tired, of course. that you could say that.
I'm working.
Yes, no. And I'm going to end with this. And maybe this is the question. This is an answer to your paper too. So that is, what is particular about history? What is the thing that we are trying to do? And I talk to my students about the 5 cons of history. The 5 cons of history. Is that in anything I ever wrote? I'm not sure.
I didn't encounter
I better write that somewhere before Rogers Brubaker, someone's going to steal that from me. Anyway. Poor Rogers. I like Rogers a lot, really.
This is the big video, just so
Oh, so yeah, I really do.
he'll be hearing it.
So, right.
That's right.
So what are these 5 cons of history? First of all, and this has come up, and Geoff has already mentioned it, context. That is time and place. The specificity of the moment is extraordinarily important. And that's sometimes very much left out in the political science that I knew about. The second is conjuncture. Different big forces and structures come together in a certain moment, and that's an important context that you have to express. The third, which is very important, and this is harder for, I think, political science and maybe sociology, is contingency, the event itself. That is, things completely unexpected happen. Lenin dies or gets a stroke at the age of early 50s, you know, and things go in a totally different direction. And from a Marxist point of view, contradiction. Things don't fit together neatly, right? They go in different directions at once in particular conjunctures. And finally, and this is not a joke, confusion. Confusion. That is, there is in history all kinds of anomalies, things that don't fit together, and that are hard at any moment to express. Now, there are historical sociologists that I tremendously admire. Michael is one of them. Obviously, we wrote a book together that no one ever read. I think because the title, I invented the title, and the title is, who would ever read a book called Intellectuals and the Articulation of the Nation? And no one read it, except you and me.
He's gracious, I think. I
All right. And, but someone like Bill Sewell is a fantastic historian and with a real sociological imagination. Here's a problem, and here's to the credit of sociologists, political scientists, and anthropologists. When I tried to teach that book to his graduate student historians, they didn't want to read it, and they didn't like the book. We are an ahistorical field, a theoretical field. Not in Michigan so much, but in general, historians don't like social theory. They don't do it. They rather go to the archives and then figure out things in a different direction. So that's a problem with history, if I had to be critical of history. But I work closely with a historical sociologist, Fatma Miguel-Gocek, and we have a project which is highly political about the Armenian genocide, trying to get Turks and Armenians and Kurds and all together to create a history where it almost didn't exist. And it was extraordinarily successful over the years, and it's a political project disguised as an intellectual project in some ways. But the idea was that it would be an intellectual project. And that project, of course, is rejected, and our findings are rejected, as you might imagine, by the Turkish state and by the pseudo-historians that work in that, you know, the denialists. And it's also rejected by Armenians, which is particularly painful. That is, just to give you one idea of the problems that you might face if you tackle some of these things, one very prominent historian, maybe the godfather of Armenian history in this country, said to me once, Ronald, don't try to explain the genocide. If you explain the genocide, you will rationalize it, and you will then justify it, right? And I'm thinking, but Babam, that's what we do. That's our thing, is to try to explain. So that's one side. So Armenians are, and one very prominent Turkish journalist, a hero of the Kurds, by the way, but he's a Turk. I can mention his name, Murat Bilge, a wonderful, important man who has to be guarded by bodyguards in Turkey, in Istanbul, as he walks the streets. Murat said to me, you were too kind to the Turks. You gave them too much. These were evil men. In other words, from both sides, there's a progressive Turk, right? He's on our side, and Armenian colleagues and comrades of mine. There's criticism of the attempt to do a more complex, nuanced explanation of this event, right? So, you know, the warning is, if you take on these tasks, whether you're a historical sociologist or a historian more narrowly, you will face these kinds of things. But it's great fun. It's great fun to push against those edges and to provoke as well.
So we had planned to go through about 2 or 3 more rounds of us, but I also promised that we would turn to you at 4:45, and it's now 4:49. So why don't we turn to you, and we'll collect, you know, like 3 or 4 short points, and if you can have short responses to them, then we might be able to get to another set, but we only have about a half an hour left. So
thank you. Wonderful, enriching event. Two quick comments. One to Ron. You mentioned some of the things that were rescued, as you saw, were rescued from the Soviet experience. Predominantly trade, industrialization, etc. I just thought, without trying to categorize them in any way, which is more important than not, that the impact of Lenin and Leninism on the national liberation movement is just so important and ranking right up there with any of these things. Not just in the toolbox of the vanguard and Leninist strategy, but hope. The possibility, you raised this in your question of despair, the possibility of turning things upside down. So you get things like Marcus Garvey, who is a nationalist, African American, Jamaican, but who is at the same time worships Lenin, despite his entirely different ideological perspective, because he opens the possibility that empire might end. And I just thought that was a point. To Geoff, at the very end of your listing of that whole discussion of the superstructure, you mentioned Stuart Hall, which you just said in the end, and Stuart Hall. I just thought that Stuart Hall is particularly important because he finds a bridge between introducing questions of culture and yet retaining some sort of allegiance to the understanding of that whole economic class structure which is underneath. And so I think that he probably needs to be underlined with a marker.
Yeah, it came at the end.
In that
just
discussion.
chronologically.
In that discussion. My question quickly to Ron relates to, at the very beginning of what you said, you mentioned catastrophe, and you associated that with October. What was the catastrophe? If I heard you right, you didn't elaborate on it in great detail beyond that. Was it the seizure of power itself? Because it seems to me that, certainly my own perspective is that it was ripe for seizure with the German army on the gates, with all that was happening, that the seizure of power was a positive thing. But then beyond that, we have the Constituent Assembly and the shutting down of that, Kronstadt in the 20s and so on. But is there a moment that it was the right thing to do in the face of basically the provisional government was dead in the water, and the Bolsheviks were ready? I just wanted to comment.
So let me collect, I have four people right now, so Holly Case, and then Ricky Hammer, and then Omar Bartov, and I'll catch my eye if we have time for more. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. These were wonderful thoughts. I would like to ask a question in connection with what Geoff said about how we need to get back to materialities and we need to find a new materialism. First of all, I wonder, Ron, whether you agree with that, because in one of your comments you seem to suggest that economics is not maybe the direction to go in terms of formulating a politics at this point, but I don't know if I understood that correctly. But my question is more to do with, it seems as though we're experiencing an anti-materialist moment where both the left and the right are converging on anti-materialism in a way that makes comparisons with fascism or with certain elements of the 19th century seem apt. And I wonder if the correct answer to that is forcing a confrontation with that kind of thinking in materialist terms, or whether an alternative, if you will, would be to try to figure out why the anti-materialist appeal is so powerful, and to contemplate an anti-materialist appeal that is not, let's say, of the right. So is there a way to think about a kind of, to endow the world with meaning, or to think about something like a common spirit that is not inherently reactionary, by way of appealing to or let's say a group of people who, at least in their explicit rhetoric, reject materialism. It's something that I think the left hasn't really tried, and not when it's in this confrontational mode. And I wonder if this might be a time to try it.
Thank you. Ricky Hammer.
Yeah, I have two things I'd like to push back on. One is the question of whether it's a good time to be a graduate student. I just wanted to say that it might be important to be self-reflexive, because this is also the time of the crackdown on the university and the loss in funding for the humanities and the social sciences and taxation for graduate students, and also a time where the combination of being an activist and being a student is incredibly time-consuming, and is not often a pair that is seen to be together. That's my one comment. My question is about, I find it interesting that particularly in the contemporary moment in the US, you continue to hold on to Marxism as your emancipatory intellectual tradition, because I suppose for a lot of us, for a lot of the grad students at Brown, there's a certain kind of malaise around traditional historical sociological questions around the working class and state formation, etc. And a lot of us have turned towards the anti-colonial tradition or different kinds of theories from the South in order to ask different questions that address legacies of empire, which, by the way, I think is the one category that we haven't really touched on today in this discussion right now, that might lead us to understand, the Trumpian moment better, that might lead us to ask different questions that might want to make you read historical sociology again. So I was just, I was wondering how you think about Marxism in the way it is centered around the white working class and its Eurocentric legacy, as opposed to other emancipatory traditions.
Thank you, Ricky. Omar.
Yeah, so I don't want to get too biographical, but I just want to mention that when I was a graduate student, which was a long time ago, I went to the Bodleian, one of the first times that I went there, I was reading essays by Jeff Ely, and thought that they're fantastic and was really inspired by them on Welle and on the Sonderweg. But what I was curious about was that you started to talk about fascism and the questions around fascism that interested you and that were obviously at the sort of basis of what you were writing, and particularly in reshaping the German right. And then you moved on to other things, and to me it seems that anyone who wants to understand the moment that we are in now should reread Reshaping the German Right, because it actually dealt within its own historical context with something that we are seeing right now in American society, in European society. I know that we are seeing that in a very different way also in Israel. That you talk about material issues. It is right at the core. What are these groups that have, so to speak, popped up and have supported this new political wave? Where are they coming from? Where were they before? How did we not talk about them? How can we not talk with them now? Why is there two totally different discourses at the universities and academia and much of higher journalism and these groups that are there, that are social reality? So I actually, my first question to you is, maybe can you think that through better than I'm doing now, just in a response to that? The second, which is related to that, is to Ron. I'm obviously a bit more pessimistic than you are, but I was just thinking along the lines that you were raising about so many issues that were not raised today and may need to be raised by historians and by historical sociologists and just normal people who think about where we live. As I see it today, the nation state is resurgent, it's not declining. And certainly many of the oppressed groups around the world, that's what they want. You speak about the Armenians, we can speak about the Kurds who have wanted it. You can speak about Palestinians. There is a desire for the nation state. There's a desire for an ethnic nation state in this country. There's a whole discourse for the nation state. Capitalism is resurgent. Capitalism has never been as powerful as it is now. Secularism is in retreat. It's not simply how come people now suddenly go for orthodox this or fundamental that. It's a major wave, not only in the West, everywhere, a sort of seeking out for spirituality, for some other keys that we don't know, I think, how to deal with. Humanism, as was mentioned before, humanistic education is in retreat, in tremendous retreat, in universities, even in the elite institutions. And ultimately, what we see is kleptocracy. The kleptocracy has become a system of rule that you find in the EU, that you find in Russia, that you find in this country, and that is a principle, in a sense, of how our new societies are functioning. And so, clearly, we need to try and understand what is this complex, and maybe you can give us some ways of thinking about it more systematically.
So do you have enough to talk about? I think we'll probably give you each 10 minutes to conclude, because we're going to have to move toward formal conclusion.
So I'll go quickly first. I'm not sure what question you were asking exactly. I mean, I tried in my ramble, I tried to pick up that particular urgency, and it is true that that's one line of continuity that runs through, for me, from what I was trying to do in the when I was a graduate student, and what I'm doing now. When I finish my 20th century Europe, I will go back to the unfinished book, which is now probably 2/3 done, which is called Genealogies of Nazism. So I'm going back to, I'm sorry if I'm not being heard properly, I'm going back to reshaping the German right to figure out what still works, what needs to be thought differently and so on. I didn't say it's a great time to be a graduate student. It's a great time to be a historian. So, that was very well taken about the conditions of the production of knowledge now, right? Stuart Hall, absolutely. And he figured at the end of my list simply by a kind of chronology. And I really agree about Lenin and self-determination, and that was not the Wilsonian moment. That was actually the Leninist moment, in my view. And I just got to have an essay out which is the opening essay in the first volume of this Cambridge History of Communism, in which I make this argument. And my charge was to do a general introductory essay on Marxism and social revolution. And I begin actually in the extra-European world in the early 1900s in order to make that point. So I really, really agree.
Yeah, I follow that. That is, the actual paper, Lessons of October, which I think I've published around several times. Don't you do that, graduate students, but when you have tenure in 2 universities, who cares? But it's about Lenin and imperialism and the anti-imperialist thrust. So that's a big part of it that I was rushing today. The catastrophe was not supposedly, it was not after October. I may have spoken too fast. It's about Stalinism. That is what ultimately becomes the nightmare. Imagine that this regime actually shoots 700, 800,000 people in a single year of their own citizens. It's a bigger Holocaust before the Holocaust, even, that. So this is not what the revolution was about. Though there were elements in the revolution, because of course they celebrated terror as well. And I have a paper on that which is in this volume as well. On the new materiality, it's a very, very good question. You know, if you read Logics of History, the Sewell book, he moves toward this. Bill is always working within some dialogue with Marxism, and his next book will be about the 18th century roots of capitalism in France and so forth, right? And what he does is use the word resources. That is, okay, we've talked about culture, we've talked about discourse. Those things are important. We can't go back. You can't reverse the cultural turn. All these categories, gender, nation, class, capitalism, are all now contested categories. They're discursively constructed. You see, you can't go back. But that doesn't mean that because you've made this epistemological revolution and you're seeing things, that that there's not ontology, that there aren't things out there which also affect the way discourses occur and how they're understood, etc. So meaning is extraordinarily important, but also the constraints, you know, structures, call them whatever, materiality. And so we're trying to work. And we just had at Michigan, Adam Tooze, really fine historian, who's working on a book on the 2008 financial crisis. It's going to be a great big thick book. And he gave this analysis, and that was really a materialist analysis, you know, in the way much of his work is. And it's very revelatory, right? So I think though, you can't go, I think the essay was called Back and Beyond. We're always going back, you know, or we're always going beyond the cultural turn or whatever. But it's always in some ways back as well to some fundamentals that we have to take seriously. And if there's one thing that we should start to think about more, and maybe this is a material thing, and it's partly a material thing, it's partly a discursive thing, is the common good. That is, what are we talking about, capitalism versus socialism? Capitalism is about private, corporate, individual profit, you know, certain kinds of advantages that can work themselves out in some way. And then there's its opposition, which Marx was part of, but other kinds of socialism, certain kinds of left liberalism is about, which is that we should also consider the common good. Some of these things are not materialist, that the rule of law, that's a common good. It's not a material thing. They have material effects. Free higher education, the right to child care, you know, or health insurance. Those are material things as well. That's what I mean by socialism, is the extension, not overthrowing capitalism. That ain't gonna happen, not in my life anymore, probably the lifetime of the graduate students. But the extension of that social common good understanding against the kind of Trumpian view of, you know, let the market do everything, private, let's make the tax code work for some people and against other people, etc. And I'm going to quote my friend here. In a meeting we had recently, he said, the only possible politics now is some kind of democratic socialism so that we can have a decent descent.
No, we've got to learn how to decline decently.
Decline decently, that's what you said it better than I misquote. But that's, you understand the thing. Which gets to Omar's point. All the things you said seem to be correct, right? Capitalism is on the right, the nation state, you know, all these different things. If I'd say let's take a more total examination. The world today is about globalization, that is this global capitalism, right? And within that, and you guys use the term modernity all the time. It's not a word I use because modernity seems to explain too many things and therefore explains nothing, but let's say modernity. Modernity is global capitalization or globalized capitalism. And within that trend, where it's going, right, certain things are happening. Wealth is being polarized, not just in the United States, but all through the developed world and between the developed world and the underdeveloped world. That's a threat to democracies. That leads to discontent. That leads to populism. That leads to anti-immigration movement, xenophobia, all those things that got Trump elected, right? That's extraordinarily important. And ultimately, it also is why the nation state? Why the nation state or why fundamentalist religion? I would say, as a response to this crisis of modernity, people are looking for a haven in a heartless world. They're looking for some provisional stabilities so that they can go on with their lives. But it's not going to work. They're being undermined at the same time. So I see those things as all connected. That's why I talk about that we're reaching a finality, a kind of crisis in those various ways. why Marxism then? My view would be, what's left of Marx, right? What's to the left of Marx in terms of other kinds of left values and programs? And what can we rescue from Marx, right? And when I said not so much economics, what I was talking about was, don't worry about, surplus value and all of that difficult economic parts of capital. They're very interesting and they're important because it's basically not an economic theory. It's a way to try to materially explain exploitation. Exploitation is a value. Exploitation is, he tried to ground that in some kind of economics. But exploitation is what the left should be against, right? Towards some kind of social justice. So there are values in Marx that I think informed our work and our passion to do this kind of work. And of course there are other emancipatory traditions like post-colonialism and so forth, which I always think is part of this Marxist approach. That is, those subaltern types that sort of came out of Marxism, they have a very serious critique of the limits and ethnocentric or Eurocentrism of Marxism, but we all, it seems to me, are informing each other. So take what you can, be eclectic, In some ways I told, and this is the last thing I'll say, I told one group, I think it was the University of Montana, I said, I'm a Burkean Marxist. Right? To be a Burkean Marxist. That is, the right also has some good ideas, that is, people like Burke. Societies are complex. They're delicately and organically intertwined. Don't be in a rush to damage them unless you know where you're going, Gorbachev, right? Things can get worse than they are at the moment. So that's my sort of Burkean Marxist. Or as I wrote in one book, yes, it's true, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break eggs, right? You have to break eggs to make an omelet. But you don't smash the eggs and all the shells into it. When you make breakfast or a revolution, you delicately break the eggs, nice and soft, and then you make the omelet. And also, this is to the younger group, remember this, once you scramble the eggs, they can't be unscrambled.
So Geoff is going to have one more comment, then I'll ask Maud, and you hold off for a final.
Oh dear.
In urging the importance of new materialism or thinking again about materialities, that's not a call to go back to to restore those earlier modes of thought or to reconstitute the base superstructure metaphor. It's a desire to think the relationship to structures and to materialities without disavowing the cultural term whatsoever. That I think we need to continue thinking about the relationship between things. And then on Marxism, when I was a young person, to be a Marxist was a self-sufficient thing, and it was the opposite of eclecticism. And in fact, eclecticism was one of the cardinal sins. You were either a Marxist or not, and you would, and if you were a Marxist, your first priority was to, demonstrate why, like liberal modes of thought were bankrupt. I still think that to a great extent. Whereas, so if I situate myself within the Marxist tradition, which is the important circumlocution that I think we arrived at during the last quarter century, it's avowedly against that kind of sectarianism, and so I think it's impossible not to be eclectic these days. So it was about the sufficiency of the Marxist tradition and the necessity, which became more and more apparent from the 1970s on, that you had to use other traditions to think with too, and freshly invented ones too. So, there was a period after 1989-91 where I actually stopped calling myself a Marxist, you know.
You never told me that.
Because there were, you know, there were serious ethico-philosophical and political reasons for rethinking, for you know, stepping back and reviewing things. And then about 10 years later, you know, I was back.
I think I was in Chicago then.
Yes, it would be. And very lastly, in around about 1991, there was a conference in Chapel Hill that political scientist, young political scientist who worked on trade unions organized. And he was a student of Seymour Martin Lipset. And the conference was on what's happened to what's happened to socialism, what's left of socialism. And it was quite a good conference, except Seymour Martin Lipset gave the keynote, right? And a great big hulking bear of a man, who hadn't changed his ideas in 30 years. And I wrote an essay for that conference that came out in a volume called Reviewing the Socialist Tradition. And it was a completely unrepentant essay, right? And my view at that time was that the end of communism also can mean the end of anti-communism. You know, it opened a space where it was possible to think things publicly in different ways. You know, now it took a while, but I think that started to happen during the last 10 years. You know? And I think we can understand the resurgence of critiques of capitalism after 2008, the return to socialist language,
The Bernie movement.
and the Sanders campaign and Corbyn and so on. You know, so I think it may have taken a quarter of a century, but that argument that the end of communism has released the constraints on the possibility of making certain kinds of arguments again. Obviously it's going to be an uphill thing for a long time.
Okay, I can't believe I'm going to be offering any closing remarks, so I'm not. Instead of making pithy, intellectually engaging remarks, actually what I've been thinking here the entire time was, how lucky I was to study with these two guys and how much of an imprint my own thinking and historical work has been shaped in ways actually, even as I sit here, that I think I wasn't all that conscious of. And that's really sort of been a powerful realization. But also that I wish I could go back to graduate school, because I think one of the things that happens as you get older is you realize what you know, what you don't know in a way you didn't before, and how valuable it would be to once again sit with you in a classroom and study. So I wish I could do that. So thank you so much, and thank you to Michael for giving me the opportunity to sit with him again for a little bit.
And actually, in that same vein, I would like to thank Geoff and Ron for showing us with their works that all history is contemporary history, which means that even if Ron would succeed and would salvage the initial revolution, we kind of have to and get to do it again.
So one of the things that I take from this, beyond all the terrific ideas, is the huge significance of being social and decent. Because one of the things that characterized the time at Michigan I enjoyed with these folks was that we were not just batting around important ideas. We weren't always gossiping, but we were certainly wondering about how each other was. And if I would take as an example of something important from this assembly today, in combination with a memory of what has been, but it also as an anticipation of what ought be, is that this is not only a place for important ideas, this is also a place where we need to take care of one another, especially for the times in which we're living. So I want to say thank you to all of you for making this such a beautiful place to be. Thank you to Maud and Juho and all of our presenters earlier for such a stimulating day. And thanks to Geoff and Ron for giving us the opportunity to now go socialize with the stuff that enables us to be even more social than we would be otherwise. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys.